The tragic fate of George Drouillard, a frontier legend. In the vast and seemingly infinite wilderness of what is now Montana, the Jefferson River once meandered through untouched landscapes. The river, named after Thomas Jefferson, was not just a physical feature. It embodied the deep complexities of the 19th century American frontier. It was a place where European explorers, fur trappers, and indigenous peoples navigated, traded, and occasionally fought for dominance. The river was a symbol of both the promise and the peril of the American frontier. It was along these waters that George Drouillard, one of the most fascinating and tragic figures of this period, met his end. Drouillard's death in 1810, at the hands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, marked the end of a journey that had seen him rise from a mixed-race youth with a promising future to a legendary frontiersman and an invaluable member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But it also signified the tension between two worlds, one of growing American expansion and the other of indigenous sovereignty. In this untamed heart of the Jefferson River, the broader forces of exploration, trade, and cultural resistance collided in a violent climax that would forever shape Drouillard's legacy. The Jefferson River itself had become a crossroads of sorts, a meeting point where Euro-American ambitions of conquest intersected with the ancient traditions of the Blackfoot and other native tribes who had long called the region home. While the river provided essential resources like water, fish, and fertile land for agriculture, it was also the artery through which the tides of history were shifting. The exploration and expansionist ambitions of the United States were pushing westward, motivated by the doctrine of manifest destiny. These movements, however, were not without significant resistance, particularly from the indigenous tribes who had long inhabited these lands and had cultivated a deep connection with the natural environment that the settlers sought to subdue. Thus, the story of George Drouillard unfolds not only as a personal tragedy, but also as part of a larger narrative about the transformative forces shaping the American frontier. It is a story of exploration, violence, cultural misunderstanding, and the enduring fight for control over land and resources. A frontier in flux. The context of Drouillard's era. To understand the significance of George Drouillard's death and his place in the history of the American frontier, one must first understand the broader historical context of the early 19th century. This was a time of monumental change, driven by expansionist ambitions, economic forces, and intense geopolitical competition. The United States, having recently emerged from its war for independence, was eager to extend its reach westward. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which effectively doubled the size of the country, opened up vast and largely unexplored territories to the young nation. This acquisition, largely motivated by President Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic, would have profound consequences, not just for the United States, but for the indigenous nations that had lived on these lands for centuries. In the years following the Louisiana Purchase, settlers, traders, and explorers flooded into the newly acquired lands, but these territories were far from empty. Indigenous peoples such as the Blackfoot Confederacy had lived in these regions for thousands of years. Their societies were intricately tied to the land, the animals, and the rhythms of nature. The arrival of settlers and fur trappers disrupted these societies in numerous ways, both directly and indirectly. The expansionist impulses of the United States, reinforced by its growing economic interests in the fur trade, created tensions between the U.S. government, its settlers, and the indigenous populations. The fur trade, which had long been an economic staple for European settlers and indigenous peoples alike, was the driving force behind much of this expansion. The demand for beaver pelts, particularly for European fashion, led to a rush to exploit the natural resources of the western frontier. Fur companies like the Missouri Fur Company, which George Drouillard joined in the early 1800s, sought to establish monopolies over the fur trade by encroaching into territories that had been long occupied by indigenous nations. These movements were met with increasing resistance, particularly from powerful groups like the Blackfoot Confederacy, who sought to protect their lands and way of life. However, this resistance was often portrayed in the context of a larger struggle between the forces of European American civilization and the so-called savagery of indigenous peoples. but for the Blackfoot and other indigenous groups, this was not simply a matter of cultural differences. It was a matter of survival. The fur trade was not just an economic competition. It was an existential threat to their autonomy, their way of life, and their relationship with the land. The life of George Drouillard, a man between worlds. George Drouillard was born in 1773 in Detroit, Michigan, to a French-Canadian father, Pierre Drouillard, and a Shawnee mother. His mixed heritage set him apart in many ways, making him a man who straddled two worlds, those of his French-Canadian and Indigenous roots. His father, a soldier, fur trader, and interpreter, instilled in George the importance of language and cultural understanding. His mother, a Shawnee woman, introduced him to the traditions and wisdom of indigenous peoples. Together, they gave him a unique perspective on the frontier and the diverse cultures that coexisted there. From an early age, George Drouillard exhibited remarkable skills that would serve him well in the wilds of the American West. He became an expert hunter-trapper and tracker, but perhaps his most valuable skill was his fluency in multiple languages. Drouillard could speak French, English, Shawnee,